There are decisions we make in seconds that echo for a lifetime. Moments where everything inside us screams to walk away, to stay safe, to let nature take its course. This is the story of one man who ignored every rational thought in his head, and what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about wild animals and the invisible threads that connect us all. James had been a ranger in the Kenyan wilderness for almost 15 years. He'd seen things that would haunt most people. Poachers leaving elephants to die slow, agonizing deaths. Wildebeest calves abandoned by their herds. The brutal, unforgiving reality of survival in the wild. He'd learned long ago not to interfere. Nature has its rules, and humans breaking those rules rarely ends well. But on this particular morning, as he drove his beaten-up truck through a dried riverbed, he saw something that stopped his heart cold. A lion. A massive male, probably around 400 pounds, lying completely still in a shallow ravine. At first, James thought the animal was dead. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of its ribcage. Barely breathing. Barely alive. James killed the engine. The silence of the African bush pressed in around him, broken only by the distant calls of birds and something else. A sound that made his blood run cold. The yipping, cackling calls of jackals. And above, circling in the pale morning sky, vultures. They were waiting. They always waited. James grabbed his binoculars. From this distance, maybe 60 feet away, he could see the lion more clearly. The animal's eyes were half open, glazed with pain. Its tongue hung from its mouth, dry and swollen. But what caught James's attention was something else entirely. Dark stains around the lion's shoulder and hindquarters. Puncture wounds. And near the lion's front leg, partially hidden in the dust, was a spent tranquilizer dart. "No," James whispered. "Not again." He'd seen this before. Poachers used darts laced with poison to take down big game. Sometimes they wanted the animal dead for body parts. Sometimes they just wanted them incapacitated so they could move through the territory safely. Either way, the result was the same. A slow, painful death. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He should call this in. Get the authorities involved. But he knew how long that would take. Hours, maybe longer. And this lion didn't have hours. He looked at the animal again. The lion's breathing was becoming more labored, shallow, desperate, and the jackals were getting braver, creeping closer. One of them was now less than 20 feet from the dying lion. James made a decision that would change everything. He reached into the back of his truck. He had a field medical kit there, including something he'd been carrying for years but never actually used. A vial of antitoxin. It was designed for snake bites primarily, but James knew from his training that it could sometimes counteract certain poisons used by poachers. The key word being sometimes. He also grabbed a water container, a tarp, and his rifle. Not to shoot the lion. But if those jackals got aggressive, he'd need something to scare them off. As he stepped out of the truck, the heat hit him like a physical wall. It had to be over 100 degrees. The smell hit him next. Blood, fear, and the acrid scent of whatever poison was coursing through that lion's system. The jackals scattered at his approach, but they didn't go far. They never went far. James walked slowly toward the lion, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every instinct he developed over 15 years in the bush was screaming at him to turn back. You don't approach a wild lion. You especially don't approach a dying, poisoned, unpredictable wild lion. But his feet kept moving forward. 40 feet. 30. 20. The lion's eye tracked him. There was awareness there, despite the poison. Despite the pain. The animal knew something was approaching. And in its current state, anything approaching was a threat. James stopped at 15 feet. He could see the lion clearly now. The magnificent black mane, matted with dirt and dried saliva. The powerful muscles, now slack and trembling. The wounds where the darts had penetrated. There were 3 of them. 3 separate puncture marks. Someone had really wanted this animal down. "Hey, big guy," James said softly. His voice shook. "I know you're scared. I know you're hurting. I'm going to try to help you, but I need you to work with me here." The lion's mouth opened slightly. A weak, rasping growl emerged. It wasn't threatening. It was the sound of an animal in agony. James set down his rifle and the water container. He kept the medical kit in his hands. Inside was the antitoxin, a syringe, and not much else that would be useful for treating a 400-pound poison lion. But it was all he had. He moved closer. 10 feet now. Close enough to see the lion's pupils, dilated and unfocused. Close enough to see the foam at the corners of its mouth. The poison was attacking the lion's nervous system. Without intervention, the animal would be dead within hours, probably less. James knelt down. Very slowly, he opened the medical kit and prepared the syringe. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to draw the antitoxin into the needle. The entire time, the lion watched him with those glazed eyes. "This is going to hurt," James whispered. "I'm sorry, but it's the only chance you've got." He moved to the lion's side. This was the most dangerous moment. He'd have to get close enough to inject the antitoxin into the lion's muscle tissue. Close enough that if the animal had any strength left at all, it could kill him in seconds. James reached out. His hand hovered over the lion's shoulder. He could feel the heat radiating from the animal's body. Fever. The poison was burning through its system. He pressed his hand against the lion's skin. The reaction was instantaneous. The lion's body convulsed. Its head whipped around faster than James thought possible for an animal in its condition. And before James could pull back, before he could react at all, the lion's jaws clamped down on his forearm. Pain exploded through James's arm. White-hot, blinding pain. He tried to pull away, but the lion's bite held firm. Not crushing. The animal didn't have the strength for that. But enough to break skin. Enough to tear flesh. "Let go," James gasped. "Please let go." He didn't know if he was begging the lion or begging God or begging the universe itself. All he knew was pain and the terror that this was how he would die. Killed by the animal he was trying to save. Then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the lion released him. James stumbled backward, clutching his arm. Blood poured between his fingers. Deep puncture wounds, 4 of them, perfectly spaced where the lion's canines had pierced his skin. He could feel his pulse pounding in the wounds, each beat sending fresh waves of agony through his arm. The lion lay still again, breathing hard, its eyes now completely closed. James stood there, bleeding, his mind racing. He should leave. He should get in his truck and drive straight to the nearest medical facility. A lion bite could cause serious infection, could cause nerve damage, could cost him his arm. But if he left now, the lion would die. There was no question about that. James looked at his arm, then at the lion, then at the syringe, still clutched in his good hand. He made his choice. Wrapping his bleeding arm quickly with a bandana from his pocket, James approached the lion again. Every cell in his body screamed at him to stop. The animal had just attacked him. It could do it again. But James had seen something in that bite. It wasn't aggression. It was fear. Pure, instinctive fear from an animal that didn't understand what was happening to it. "I know," James said quietly. "I know you're terrified. But I'm still going to help you." This time, he moved even more carefully. He chose a spot on the lion's hindquarters, away from its head, away from those powerful jaws. In one quick motion, he plunged the needle into the muscle and depressed the plunger. The antitoxin flowed into the lion's system. James withdrew the needle and backed away quickly. The lion didn't react this time. Didn't even flinch. The animal was too far gone. Now came the waiting. The antitoxin would either work, or it wouldn't. The lion would either survive the next few hours, or it wouldn't. And James, with his mangled arm and questionable judgment, would either make it out of this situation alive, or he wouldn't. He sat down heavily in the dirt, about 10 feet from the lion. His arm throbbed. His head spun. Adrenaline was wearing off, and shock was starting to set in. He looked at his arm. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. The wounds were deep. He'd need stitches. Probably antibiotics. Probably a lot of things. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. The jackals had returned. They sat in a semicircle, watching, waiting. Vultures continued to circle overhead. The sun climbed higher, turning the ravine into an oven. James pulled out his water container and took a long drink. Then, against every bit of common sense he possessed, he dragged himself closer to the lion. He poured water into his cupped hand and held it near the lion's mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lion's tongue moved, weakly lapping at the water. It was a small sign, but it was something. James repeated this several times, offering water, waiting, offering more. The lion drank a little each time. Its breathing seemed slightly less labored. Or maybe James was imagining it. Maybe he was just desperate to believe the antitoxin was working. An hour passed. Then two. James's arm had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The pain was constant now, a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. He knew he was in trouble, knew he needed medical attention, but he stayed. In the third hour, something changed. The lion's eye opened, fully opened, and for the first time, there was clarity in that gaze. The animal looked at James, really looked at him, not with aggression, not with fear, with something that looked almost like recognition. James felt tears prick his eyes. "You're going to make it," he whispered. "You're going to be okay." The lion closed its eye again, but its breathing was definitely better now. Stronger, more regular. James finally allowed himself to stand. His legs shook. His vision swam. He needed to get help. Needed to get his arm treated before the infection spread. But he also needed to make sure the lion would be safe. He dragged the tarp over to provide some shade for the animal. He left the remaining water nearby. And then, with great difficulty, he climbed back into his truck. The drive to the nearest ranger station took 40 minutes. By the time James arrived, he was barely conscious. His arm was on fire, his vision tunneling. He stumbled through the door and collapsed. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. The first face he saw was his supervisor, Marcus, sitting in a chair beside him. The older man's expression was a mix of relief and exasperation. "You're an idiot," Marcus said. "You know that, right?" James tried to smile, but his mouth was too dry. "The lion," he croaked. "Did it survive?" "Against all odds, it survived. We tracked it down the day after you came in. Found it in that ravine, weak but alive. Got a proper vet out there. Finished what you started." Marcus shook his head. "You almost didn't survive, though. That bite got infected. But you've been delirious with fever for 2 days. Kept mumbling about lions and poison and saving something." James looked at his arm. It was heavily bandaged, hooked up to in 4 dripping antibiotics into his system. The doctors said another few hours and you might have lost the arm. Might have lost your life. Marcus leaned forward. "Was it worth it, James? Was saving that lion worth almost dying?" James didn't answer immediately. He thought about those moments in the ravine. The fear, the pain, the impossible choice between his own safety and an animal's life. "Yes," he said finally. "Yeah, it was." Marcus sighed. "You're definitely an idiot. But you're a brave idiot. I'll give you that." James spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The infection was stubborn, requiring multiple courses of antibiotics. His arm healed slowly, leaving 4 permanent scars where the lion's teeth had pierced his skin. Scars he would carry for the rest of his life. When he was finally released, the first thing he did was ask about the lion. The vet report said the animal had made a full recovery. The antitoxin had worked, flushing the poison from its system just in time. The lion had been tracked for a few days to ensure it was healthy, then left alone to return to its territory. James wanted to see it, needed to see it, just to know for sure. 3 weeks after the incident, James returned to the ravine. His arm was still weak, still healing, but he could drive again. He parked his truck in the same spot where he'd first seen the dying lion. The ravine was empty. No blood. No evidence that anything had happened there. Nature had already erased the traces of that day. James sat there for an hour, scanning the area with his binoculars, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lion. Nothing. The animal had moved on, as wild animals do. Found new territory, continued its life. It was what James had hoped for. What he'd risked everything for. But still, part of him felt a strange emptiness. He'd shared something profound with that lion. A moment of connection that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. And now it was just over. He was about to start the engine and leave when he heard it. A roar. Deep, powerful, unmistakable. The roar of a healthy lion. James's heart leaped. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the area frantically. There, on a rocky outcrop about 200 yards away, stood the lion. Its black mane flowing in the wind, its posture strong and proud. And the lion was looking directly at him. For a long moment, neither moved. James held his breath, his hands trembling as he held the binoculars steady. The lion stood still as a statue, its gaze fixed on the truck. Then the lion did something extraordinary. It sat down on its haunches and continued to watch. Not threatening, not aggressive, just watching. James lowered the binoculars. Even at this distance, he could feel the connection. The lion remembered. Somehow, despite the poison, despite the trauma, despite everything, the animal remembered the human who had refused to let it die. They stayed like that for maybe 5 minutes. Man and lion, separated by 200 yards and an unbridgeable gap between species, yet connected by something neither could fully understand. Finally, the lion stood, turned, and disappeared into the bush. James sat in his truck, tears streaming down his face, not entirely sure why he was crying. The months that followed were strange. James returned to his regular duties, guiding patrols through the reserve, monitoring wildlife, dealing with the occasional poaching incident. But he found himself driving past that ravine often. More often than necessary, really. And he started noticing something odd. The lion, his lion as he'd started thinking of it, had established territory that included that ravine. James would spot him regularly, usually at a distance, often with a small pride. 2 lionesses and, eventually, 3 cubs. What was even stranger was that whenever James was in the area, the lion seemed to know. James would be driving along, and suddenly the lion would appear, watching from a ridge or a cluster of rocks. Never approaching, never threatening, just present. Other rangers noticed it too. "That lion's got an interest in you," Marcus observed one day. "Keeps showing up whenever you're around. It's almost like it's keeping an eye on you." James just shrugged, but inside he knew. The bond formed in that ravine hadn't ended. It had evolved into something else. Something he couldn't quite name. 6 months after the rescue, James was conducting a survey in a particularly dense area of the reserve. He'd left his truck to examine some tracks on foot, trying to identify what animals had passed through recently. He was so focused on the ground that he didn't hear the approach until it was too late. A Cape buffalo. Massive. And based on its posture and the way it lowered its head, extremely aggressive. Cape buffalo are considered one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. They're unpredictable, powerful, and when they charge, they rarely stop until whatever threatened them is dead. James froze. He was in the open, at least 30 yards from his truck. The buffalo was between him and safety. His rifle was in the truck. He had nothing. The buffalo snorted, pawed the ground. Every sign pointed to an imminent charge. James's mind raced. If he ran, the buffalo would catch him in seconds. If he stood still, the buffalo might lose interest. Or it might charge anyway. There was no good option. The buffalo lowered its head further. Its muscles tensed. This was it. After everything James had survived, he was going to die because of a territorial buffalo. And then, from the brush to his left, a roar split the air. Not just any roar. The roar of a lion in full fury. The buffalo's head whipped around. James turned, his heart pounding. The lion burst from the brush, moving with terrifying speed. Its black mane seemed to radiate power. Its roar echoed across the plain. The buffalo hesitated. It was larger than the lion, probably outweighed it by several hundred pounds. But lions were apex predators. The buffalo knew this. Every animal in Africa knew this. The lion positioned itself between James and the buffalo. It roared again, a sound of pure dominance. For a tense moment, the 2 animals faced each other. Then the buffalo, deciding this wasn't worth the risk, turned and trotted away. James stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The lion turned to look at him, And in that moment, James saw it clearly. Recognition, memory, and something that looked impossibly like intentional protection. The lion had saved him. The animal he'd rescued 6 months ago had just returned the favor. They stared at each other. James wanted to say something, to thank the animal, to acknowledge what had just happened. But words seemed inadequate. Instead, he just nodded. A small gesture of respect and gratitude. The lion held his gaze for another moment. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the brush. James's legs gave out. He sat down hard in the dirt, his whole body shaking. He stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, just breathing, trying to comprehend what had occurred. When he finally made it back to his truck and drove back to the station, Marcus took one look at his face and asked what happened. James told him. Every detail. Marcus listened in silence. When James finished, the older man sat back in his chair. You know nobody's going to believe that, right? Marcus said. I know, James replied. But you're sure it happened? You're sure it was the same lion? I'm absolutely certain. Marcus nodded slowly. Then I believe you. I don't understand it. Can't explain it. But I believe you. That night, James sat outside his small ranger cabin, looking up at the stars that stretched across the African sky. His arm ached, a phantom pain in the scars left by the lion's bite. But that pain felt different now. Not like a reminder of danger or a near-death experience. It felt like a connection. A physical mark of a bond that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Over the following years, James and the lion continued to cross paths. The lion aged as all animals do. Its mane grew more silver. Its movements became slightly less fluid. But it remained in that territory, raising its cubs, defending its pride. And whenever James was near, the lion would make its presence known. A glimpse on a ridge. A roar in the distance. A reminder that some connections, no matter how improbable, endure. James eventually retired from the ranger service. He stayed in Kenya, though, unable to leave the land that had shaped him, the place where he'd learned that the barriers we build between ourselves and the natural world are sometimes less solid than we believe. He still drives through that reserve, still passes by that ravine where everything changed. And sometimes, even now, he swears he can hear a roar in the distance. The lion is probably long gone now, its lifespan in the wild limited. But the memory remains. The memory of a choice made in an impossible moment. The memory of pain and fear and desperate hope. The memory of two beings from different worlds, connected by something deeper than instinct or training or logic. James knows what people think when he tells this story. He sees the skepticism in their eyes. The polite nods that really mean they think he's embellished the truth, or that he's misinterpreting animal behavior, or that he's simply mistaken. But James knows what he experienced. He carries the proof on his arm. For scars that ache when the weather changes. For permanent reminders of the day he chose compassion over common sense. And he'd make the same choice again. Without hesitation. Without doubt. Because in that ravine, in those desperate hours, James learned something that most people never discover. He learned that the world is stranger and more beautiful than we allow ourselves to believe. That consciousness exists in forms we don't fully understand. That gratitude and memory and connection aren't uniquely human traits. He learned that sometimes, when you save a life, that life might just save you back. Not in any way you expect. Not in any way that makes logical sense. But in ways that matter more than logic ever could. This is the story James tells to anyone who'll listen. Not because he needs them to believe it, but because he thinks the world needs more stories like this. Stories that remind us we're not separate from nature. We're part of it. And when we act with compassion, when we choose kindness even when it's dangerous or foolish or makes no rational sense, we open doors to connections we never knew were possible. The scars on his arm ache tonight. Rain is coming. James can feel it in the old wounds the way sailors feel approaching storms in their bones. He stands on his porch, looking out at the darkening sky, and he smiles. Somewhere out there, in the vast African wilderness, a line of lions continues. Cubs grown to adults. Adults having cubs of their own. A legacy that started with one poisoned lion and one foolish human who couldn't walk away. And maybe, just maybe, in the genetic memory of those lions, passed down through generations, there's an echo of that day. A whisper that says humans can be more than threats. That sometimes, rarely, they can be something else. They can be saviors. They can be friends. They can be family. James touches the scars on his arm, feeling the familiar texture of old wounds that never quite healed properly. And he thinks, not for the first time, that these are the best scars he's ever earned.